FNB BER civil construction confidence increased to 23 in the second quarter of the year, up from 21 in the previous quarter. And with us in studio to discuss this is Cees Bruggemans. He's chief economist at FNB. Thanks so much, Cees, for joining us this afternoon. Well, taking a look at things, we've seen an overall slight increase on the quarter-on-quarter confidence levels, enough to get excited about the prevailing business conditions within the sector?
Yes, because we probably have seen the bottom. This very small increase in confidence basically reflects a slight increase in activity levels in the first half of this year compared to the last year. And under these kind of circumstances, one would look for better going forward.
Of course, we have gotten used to very up and down movements. So let's emphasize that, that point that you're making, that we've perhaps reached the bottom, an indication that we've reached a bottom and set to improve from here on out. Is that?
Yes, very much so. Of course, the bottom is very, very low. And at the same time, one picks up the kind of evidence that suggests that indeed there is an improvement taking place. But I would not want to overstate that. But every turn in every cycle has to start with very low levels. And that is essentially, I think, what we're seeing at this point in time, given the indication forward that there seems to be some pickup of activity occurring.
Absolutely, because we're still far off those levels that we saw, 3 years ago, where we were sitting closer to 90, right?
Very much so. At this point in time, only 1 in 4 contractors expresses confidence. And that tells you there's a long way to go. And of course, the sentiment in the industry is very poor.
Let's hone in on some of the factors at play here, because playing some part in influencing sentiment seems to be rising volumes. Yes,
there you can distinguish between the various market segments. It is the bigger projects of the public corporations, specifically Eskom, Trans-Caledonian, Caledon, the Sunroll, Transnet, where effectively they seem to have secured financing, where previously that was a problem, and long announced projects are now seemingly starting to run. When it comes to the government sector, it is especially the provinces, but with small projects, while local government still is absent, mostly. And then in the private sector, it is primarily mining, where there seems to be some activity pickup, compared to building, which still remains low.
Yeah, so it's still illustrative of the fact that, what's holding back a more significant rise is that we are still facing constrained demand. Is that
very much so. Indeed, the point we're making is that the confidence remains relatively low. The pickup in confidence remains relatively low because demand is still so very weak. The improvement there is really very minor at this point in time.
And with that being the kind of supply-demand dynamic that's playing itself out, safe to assume that tendering competition is still very fierce, and so we're still seeing those profitability levels pretty depressed at this stage.
In other words, the industry shows all the problems that it has been having in the course of the recession. Fierce tendering, depressed profitability, cutting costs, specifically laying off people. Those remain the realities for this point in time, but it is the forward-looking indicators that suggest there's an improvement taking place.
Of course, you've touched on the fact that we've had one of the impacts being cost cutting and looking at where those efficiencies are looking to be derived primarily from job cutting. Is that a scenario that's set to get worse, do you think?
No, not in terms of the way that then things are changing. So given that the industry basically laid off nearly half its workforce last 2 years, and given that activity levels starting to pick up, and given that the forward-looking indicators suggest that there is more improvement to come, which presumably will translate into better turnover numbers later this year, into next year. In this industry, this tends to be closely associated, correlated with employment levels. And under those circumstances, I would imagine that in coming quarters we're going to see that the employment levels will rise in this industry, but from very low levels and presumably very gradually.
What are you anticipating in terms of overall outlook as we progress through the next half of this year in terms of confidence levels here? Because one thing that the markets across the board are waiting for is for that government spend to start filtering through within the construction space specifically.
Yeah, well, the expectation remains modest. One wants to see follow-through. There is more tendering activity, but given the problems that we've seen in the past, it has to materialize that the financing is there, that the project approval is timeous, and that the project planning proceeds better than what it has. On this score, there seems to be more tendering activity. and one waits for the contracts to be allocated so that people can get to work. Just how much of an increase quantitatively that will be in the second half going into next year, that remains to be seen. But the expectation is for improvement, not for further deterioration.